Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes. We could have actually met around the round table with our number, but quality is always more important than the numbers. We are glad you're here, and today we have a very interesting topic, which is on sectarianism in the Muslim world, but Alevi sectarianism and the politics of Alevi identity in Turkey. And our speaker today has just finished a fantastic dissertation, and I was very pleased to read. Mr. Talha Kose, who finished his dissertation on the politics of Alevi identity and the discourses of narratives of victimization among the Alevis in Turkey at George Mason's program in conflict resolution. Talha Kose grew up in Istanbul and attended the Political Science and International Relations Department at Boğaziçi University. For those of you who know Turkey, they know that in order to enter that department, that university, you have to rank in the top 500 of the national examination for 2 million people. So you must be either in 500 or 200, wherever you were, but that was your undergraduate, where I also attended. And then Talha did his MA at Sabancı University, a private university in Istanbul, and came to America for his PhD to George Mason University, ICAR. Even as a graduate student, Talha published a lot on international politics and also on issues of conflict resolution and Middle Eastern politics. In fact, he has multiple articles on, one of them is on the idea of dialogue of civilizations, alliance of civilization, another one on Iran's nuclear project in different think tanks, and in fact he is the research director of a think tank branch in DC, of Turkish think tanks branch in DC. But we are very happy that he is also our research fellow this semester, trying to turn his dissertation into a book project. And we will hear soon about what that book will involve in his talk on the politics of Alevi identity in Turkey.
Thank you, Cemil. It was really a pleasure to be in George Mason Global Center for Global Islamic Studies. So it's a really nice environment, and I'm pleased to be here. So I spent more than 7 years at ICAR, so it's a different experience, but I really enjoyed my study here. And I have presented a couple of different versions of Alevi identity, but today I will mostly emphasize the Alevi identity politics in Turkey. And in my doctoral research, my puzzle was in the post-1980 Turkey, Alevis experienced the transformation, and in new urban modern context, how they remade, how they restructured their identity. So what were the elements of this identity transformation, and what were the main dynamics that kept Alevi identity together. So although it has background, but the Alevi identity politics in itself can be traced back to 1980s. Before that, there were some other debates which I will get into the details. And as well as it's very important for the understanding the dynamics of modern Turkish identity, because it's presented as one of the the Turkish version of Islam by the establishers of the Turkish Republic, as well as one of the reasons why I studied Alevis is to understand the sectarian conflicts in the Muslim world. So we have seen many sectarian conflicts, but this Alevi identity has been managed non-violently. So can we understand something from the Alevi identity? What may be the experiences? So, of course, once I get into the detail, I learned that it's very different than the other sectarian conflicts. But it was a really interesting learning experience for me. So, I would like to mainly emphasize the Alevi identity politics in this presentation, and where Alevi-Sunni relations and Alevi-state relations stand in the making of the Turkish national identity. So the Alevi issue is one of the Turkey's most complicated and at the same time commonly misunderstood problems. Unlike the Kurdish issue and the secular conservative social and political tensions, the Alevi issue attracted less attention in academic and policy circles in Turkey. This is predominantly due to non-violent nature of post-1980 Alevi revival in Turkey. Alevi issue has often been discussed over the certain proxy tensions. Debates on the issue is in various social and political contexts have often been stuck on the limited list of Alevi identity-based claims, such as the Alevi religious places and compulsory religious education. The Alevi name means belonging to Ali and sympathizing and elevating the status of Ali among all other figures in Islamic history. In some countries such as Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Egypt, and Iran, Alevi is used for those who come from the lineage of Ali. The term Alevi, the group that is subject to this study, have been used to refer to social and historical phenomena since 19th century in Turkey. So before 19th century, the term Kızılbaş have been used. And with the nationalization project, the name Alevi has started to be used in order to connect it to Islam. Similar thing happened in Syria as well. So Nusayris has been defined as the Alevis. So if you look at the historical background in Ottoman records, the name Kızılbaş, Rafizi, Mülhit, Işık, Torlak have been used instead of Alevi. And the most common and popular name referred to this heterodox community during the Ottoman era was Kızılbaş. But Kızılbaş has some other connotations as well. It was politicized, which had the connotations of rebel, religiously heterodox, and sometimes sexually pervert. And the concept had been loaded with negative stereotypes. So it tried to be cleansed at the Young Turk era, at the last, late Ottoman era. So in a sense, the concept had been gentrified. And Alevi is one of the largest identity groups in Turkey, are geographically spread all over Turkey. Alevi identity has traditionally been a strong identity with clear cultural boundaries, moral values, rituals, and shared collective emotions. This identity historically and culturally has ethnic-sectarian origins, which have been maintained for centuries through endogamous social order in rural contexts. So Alevi groups were mainly endogamous, and for centuries it has been mainly maintained in that way. And because of the process of rapid urbanization and modernization, traditional Alevi identity and social order have been transforming into new forms. People who are involved in the Alevi identity politics may have a wide variety of objectives, including the establishment of the Alevi political party, getting Alevi recognized as a separate religion. However, the common claim of the diverse groups within the Alevi community who are involved in the struggle is the quest for public recognition. So, other than the previous struggles, the highlight of the post-1980 Alevi struggle is quest for recognition. And recognition, first and foremost, is the acknowledgement of the past crimes, assaults, and unjust practices against Alevis by the Turkish state and the Sunnis, and mainly acknowledgement of the victimhood of the Alevis. And secondly, the legal and political steps that would fulfill the demands related to the group's rights of the Alevis. And currently, the Justice and Development Party government has recently undertaken a series of steps to understand and respond to Alevi identity-based claims. So this is the first time in Turkish history political authorities taking Alevi issue and trying to address the Alevi identity-based claims. So in that sense, it's very important. And the party is in itself as a conservative Sunni background party. So it's the beginning of the engagement, but I think it's very important in that sense. So why Alevi issue is so important in terms of understanding the dynamics of identity issues in Turkey and in other parts of the Muslim world? So there are a couple of reasons for this. Some of the major cleavages in Turkish politics are correlated to Alevi issue. In other terms, without grasping the significance and the complexity of Alevi issue, we can hardly understand the dynamics of left-right and conservative Islamists and secularists and the center-periphery cleavages in Turkish politics. So, Turkish left parties, civil society organizations, and labor unions would be very weak without the participation of the Alevi citizens. They are traditionally actively involved in the leftist politics and Turkish politics. And they are loyal supporters of social democratic parties and in some minor extreme parties. So they are in a bloc. Alevis are part of the leftist politics, leftist spectrum in Turkish politics. And in terms of the secularist conservative tension, they are at the same time important bloc pro-secularist coalition in Turkey. But the form of secularism is predominantly anti-Islamist in nature. And Alevi citizens constitute one of the most significant popular support base of pro-secular basis of Turkish ideology. And they are not secular in terms of social and communal organizations, but secularist in terms of their political orientations. And they are highly critical of Islamist politics and the rising religiosity in Turkish politics. So they are really concerned about the conservative religious movements in Turkey. And since the beginning of the Turkish Republic, they were predominantly pro-secularist. And in terms of understanding the center-periphery politics in Turkey, they are part of the coalition of periphery in Turkish politics. They are predominantly rural population with working class backgrounds, and they are underrepresented in the elite bureaucratic posts. The process of urbanization and diversification of the social and economic status are new for Alevis. So right now they are getting into some government posts, but they are mainly periphery during the Ottoman era. And unlike the other periphery groups, conservative Sunnis and Kurdish groups, they don't share a lot with the other peripheral groups. But we have to understand, the Alevis within the peripheral politics and Turkish politics. And second important, significance of the Alevi identity is it's an example of non-violent sectarian identity transformation. In a sense, it's a non-violent social change. It's an example of post-1980 Alevi identity politics. And sectarian grievances and polarization have led to serious problems and violence in many parts of the Muslim world, including Iraq, Lebanon, Pakistan, Afghanistan. And there is an increasing trend of sectarian polarization and violence. In fact, the sectarian conflicts may be the main source of polarization in the Muslim world, where there are weak state structures. So Alevi revival was less sectarian and less violent in comparison to both other sectarian conflicts in the world and in comparison to Kurdish identity politics in Turkey. So there are some working mechanisms in that sense which may help us understand managing other sectarian conflicts. And thirdly, the important dynamic of Alevi identity politics is the emotions and historical narratives play a significant role in the formation and transformation of the Alevi identity. So different parts of the history, they define themselves differently. So in the Ottoman period, they were periphery, they were against the Ottoman order, they were together with the Safavids. And in 1980s, they were leftists, and in 1960s, they were pro-secularist. But what kept that, the Alevi identity is their collective emotions and narratives of victimhood. And this is very important. And when you talk with the people, their definition of themselves and their definition of Alevi communities highly related to their collective emotions. So in that sense, without understanding the collective emotions, we cannot understand the dynamics of Alevi identity. And we may not also address the problems related to Alevi identity politics. So that's one of the, I think, highlights of this research. So I would like to give more background about the Alevis. So who are Alevis? Alevis do not want to be defined by outsiders, especially conservative Sunni scholars and theologians. Therefore, like many other non-Alevi scholars writing on the subject, I am cautious about definitive statements on Alevilik. There are many different versions and definitions of Alevilik, including the Turkish version of Islam, separate religion, political movement, heterodox Sufi tradition. So if you talk to Alevi scholars, Alevi intellectuals, they give you different definitions. There's no agreement on that. But they don't want to be defined by the outsiders. So rather than defining the Alevilik, they want to be recognition and appreciation of all these versions. So my personal understanding of Alevilik, according to literature that I found convincing, is that it's the related to Islamization of nomadic Turkoman tribes in Central Asia and in Anatolia, and their heterodox and non-scriptural and Sufi understanding of Islam, which have been reproduced by different discursive frames and narratives. So I think it's a heterodox phenomenon, and it's mainly the Turkish interpretation of the nomadic Turkoman's interpretation of Islam. And in terms of their population in Turkey, there are different ideas. If you talk to Alevi politicians, they say there are 20 million, 30 million. But I think, I checked a couple of, there's no sectarian-based data in Turkey in that sense. There are some educated estimations, and I think it's maybe 10% of the Turkish population, which makes between 7 to 10 million. And in terms of geographic location, they are mainly stationed in the central and eastern Anatolia, but beginning with the 1960s, majority of population of Alevis migrated to the big cities like Istanbul, Ankara, and there are a lot of Alevi population in Europe as well. In terms of their ethnic origins, Alevis are mainly Turkoman, so they maybe 80% Turks, and maybe 15% Kurds and Zazas. And there are also Arab Alevis in the southern parts of Turkey, but I don't include in the Anatolian Alevis. And there are also 12 Shias in eastern Turkey, but in two cities, Iğdır and Kars. But they're also outside of the Alevi, which I call. And in terms of their leadership status, they have the Dede lineages, which argue that they come from the Prophet's family, and they are doing the special ceremonies. And today, association leaders, Bektashi fathers, and even the writers, intellectuals play important leadership role within the Alevi community. And in terms of their rituals, they do the gem ceremonies, Muharrem rituals, which is similar to Shiite. Some of them are similar to Shiite rituals. And if you look at the origins of the Alevilik, if you talk to Alevi intellectuals, they start with the 10,000 years of, the Anatolian ethos, the Sumerians, There are some people who start with that, and some others start with the Karbala massacre and the division within the Islam. Some others also, explain it with the division of Ottoman Soviet in 16th century. And, even the Kurdish Alevis believe that it's the Mesopotamia phenomenon. So this high, there's wide variety of beginnings for Alevi history. So as I said, the thing that comes more convincing to me is, Islamization of the two common tribes. So what's the Alevi identity transformation, and what happened starting from the 1960s to 1980s, and what's happening today? So, and my major research question was, what were the elements of continuity and what were the elements of change in Alevi identity? And with the modernization and urbanization and transformation of the political activities, they transferred from traditional rural oral culture to modern urban and written culture. So new media played a role. So the lineages are no more orally transmitting the Alevi tradition. And they were living in the isolated places in Anatolia, mostly because of the fear of the, the central administration. And with this transformation, they moved to cities, and they started to live with other people and Sunnis. And they were very homogeneous, with the peasant background. But with the modernization, with the urbanization, Alevi community gets more stratified. So no more the Dedes are no more the the predominant figures. They are Alevi businessmen, Alevi bureaucrats. So they are getting much more diversified within this transformation. And the narratives of victimhood, especially the events of 1990 Sivas massacre and a couple of other experiences, played important role in transformation of the Alevi identity. And Alevi diaspora, especially in Germany and Denmark and France, also played important role in Alevi revival. And the early texts of the Alevi identity politics have been formulated by the diaspora Alevis. So diaspora played in the early periods of the Alevi identity politics. So now I would like to talk about how Turkish national identity building project located Alevis, and where do Alevis stand, Alevis and Sunnis stands in the the national identity building project. So the Kemalist identity building project attempted to create an ethnically homogeneous, religiously secularized and culturally westernized citizens out of the Muslim subjects that were living under the territories of Anatolian Thrace. The objective of the Republican modernization project was broader than secularizing the political system and institution. The project intended to create a new state with its modern secular institutions as well as new society. Ethnic, sectarian, and religious-oriented differences and affiliations would eventually become irrelevant if this top-down social and political engineering master plan was successful. So the establishers of the Turkish Republic aimed this. And the Kemalist identity building project promised a better and brighter future for all the citizens of the Turkish Republic. But the traditional loyalties and values were impediments to the modern enlightenment for the notion of the future. So Alevis who suffered social and economic sectarian persecutions and oppressions during the Ottoman era were excited about this new modern secular project. So it was a new beginning for the Alevis, and they thought the secularism may be better for them. And however, the traditional loyalties of the Alevis were also threat to the ideal vision of modern Turkish national identity. So, like other groups, you know, the conservative Sunnis or Kurdish groups that have traditional loyalties, it was also a problem for the Alevis as well. And the ideal practical definition of Turkish citizenship was based on the criteria of being Turkish-speaking, preferably from the Balkans, nominally Sunni Muslim of Hanefi sect, and in terms of political and culture and lifestyle, secular and pro-Western. So that was the ideal definition of Turkish identity in the early years of the Turkish Republic. And some people argue that this is still an ongoing thing. And on the other hand, the nominal definition of Islam was based on the Hanefi Sunni understanding of Islam, which was also represented by the Administration of Religious Affairs, Diyanet, in Turkey. So although there was a project of secularization, the definition of Islam is also done by the state, and this definition was based on the Sunni definition. So it seems a kind of contradiction, but it's part of the, you know, the paradox of Turkish secularism. So according to the popular belief of Alevis, Mustafa Kemal's plans to build a secular nation has been supported by Bektashis. Bektashis hoped that they would be exempt from the prohibition of dervish orders. Some Bektashis also expected that far from abolishing the order, Bektashi should be the religion of the whole Turkish people. So Bektashi understands. So some early Bektashis expected that this would be the ideal religion for the new republic. And this form of Turkish Islam was considered to be better and alternative for the Kemalist regime, but it was not convincing alternative that might have been embraced by the majority Sunni population. The loss of the Balkans and the other Muslim provinces of the Ottoman Empire after the World War I and the emergence of the nationalist movements such as the Arab nationalism necessitate the emphasis on national symbols and ties. References to Central Asian culture and religions were important for construction of the Turkish national identity. And those references were more visible in the cultural practices of Alevi community. Bahar Said, who started his research on Kızılbaş Alevis during the late Ottoman era, had positive perspective on Alevis. Bahar Said's perspective was from the nationalist point of view, and he described Alevi Bektashi culture as the authentic Turkish culture, which remained unspoiled by cosmopolitan ideals and Arab culture. Bahar Said's and the nationalist point of view became more relevant after the establishment of the Turkish Republic and abolishing of the Caliphate. So the search for authenticity in the Central Asian Turkish culture did not work. However, within the process of creating a Turkish nation in the late Ottoman and early Republic in Turkey, Alevi Bektashi understanding of Islam was tried to be highlighted in order to create a Turkish Islam. So there was a project of the, the Turkish nationalist idea of Turkish Islam, and this idea, the Alevi Bektashi teachings fit to that idea much better than the previous ideas. And the ethnic origins of the Alevi identity and the relationship of this identity to pre-Islamic Turkish culture had been appreciated by official identity because those sources contributed to official Turkish historical narrative as well. So, in order to create this Turkish national narrative, those Alevi and Bektashi teachings help to those narrative as well. On the other hand, the ethno-religious dimension of Alevi identity had not been recognized by the official ideology. So they are not accepted as a separate identity group. Their different understanding of religion is not, our grassroots understanding of Islam is not appreciated. That was still a top-down approach. So neither the Turkish state trusted Alevis as the constructive element of the Turkish national identity, nor had Alevis abandoned their ethnic and communal allegiances for the sake of secular civic national identity. So if we get into the paradoxes of the Turkish secularism, as the Republican regime pushed for the reforms of secularization, it started to lose the loyalties of the Kurdish and conservative Sunni citizens. So after the end of the Caliphate, abolishing of the Caliphate, and secularism reforms, loyalties of the conservative Sunnis and Kurdish people weakened. On the other hand, position of Alevis were diametrically opposed. Loyalties of the Alevi citizens to the Republican regime increased with secularization efforts. This was delicate balance for the Turkish state. So for the rest of the the Republican era, the Turkish state, the establishment tried to balance this idea. So whenever the Islamist politics get stronger in Turkish politics, they supported the Alevis, and whenever some separatist or leftist tendencies increase, state had a project of strengthening the conservative Islam, and this delicate balance tried to be balanced by the state, but it also created social tensions between the Alevis and Sunnis and Alevis and other groups in Turkey. So for many Alevis, Atatürk had the plan to create a, Atatürk's ideas to create the Turkish Republic were influenced by the Bektashi teachings. So if you talk to the Alevi leaders, they say that this project, the Republican project, was inspired by the Bektashi teachings. And many Alevis also today argue that Atatürk had been influenced by Alevi Bektashi teachings because he was in touch with the Bektashi leaders when he was determining the founding principles of Turkish Republic. However, Mustafa Kemal's alliance with the Bektashi fathers and Alevi Bektashi community seems to be more likely to be a pragmatic rather than ideological alliance. So Atatürk played very well with the different groups, and Bektashi fathers were definitely more loyal to Atatürk. Despite this working relationship, Atatürk had not refrained from closing the Bektashi lodges within the general agenda of secularizing and centralizing the young Turkish Republic. So all the Bektashi lodges have been closed and the titles of the Bektashi fathers have been taken. And the Alevi Bektashis didn't perceive this policy as a specific attack on their community and their institutions. In fact, they argue that this policy was helpful in closing the dysfunctional institutions that was already spoiled and had been administered by the Naqshbandi order after the closing of the Janissary Corps. So some people, after the closing of the Janissary Corps in the late Ottoman era, Bektashi order had been transferred to Naqshbandi order. And some of the Kemalist Alevis believe that this policy didn't affect too much of Bektashi because the order was already spoiled by the late Ottoman era. So it was a clean starting. But Bektashi lodges were the only institutions for the Bektashis, although Sunnis in Turkey have other institutions, and Diyanet administration of religious affairs maintained the Sunni teachings in Turkey. But Alevis stayed without any central institutions. So that was one of the paradoxes or traumatic experiences for Alevis. So from the 1960s, the alliance between Kemalism and Alevis has been established against political Sunnism. So despite all these narratives, the alliance between the Kemalism and Alevis during the 1930s, 1940s, this wasn't a working relationship. Indeed, Alevis were at the periphery as well, and their tradition had not been appreciated. But this, right now there's in Turkish national narrative, people argue that there's an alliance between Alevis and Kemalism. I think it's a construction of 1960s, where Alevi teachings has been used in order to balance the rising political Islam starting from 1960s. And for example, Bozarslan criticized the week which argued that Alevi gave up its opposition against the state and become natural ally of the Kemalist Republic in the single-party period. The Kemalist Alevi proximity has rather been reinterpreted and even invented by Turkish intelligentsia in 1960s and 70s. So the narrative does not reflect the power praxis of a single-party period. So during this time, starting from the 1960s, some of the Alevis who felt loyal to Kemalist regime tried to present Atatürk as the revolutionary leader. There's even a very common belief in Alevis. They argue that Atatürk is the reincarnation of Ali himself. And when you go to houses of Alevis, you see the photo of Ali, Hacı Bektaş Veli, founder of the Bektaş order, and Atatürk together. So in the Alevi iconography, the place of Atatürk is very important. And if you get rid of, if you take the Atatürk out of this triangle, You can hardly construct an Alevi identity. So it's a kind of interesting development. So although they were also persecuted during that time, many Alevis believe that Atatürk, saved them from the oppressive Ottoman regime, and he was like the savior, and he was like the reincarnation of the Ali himself. So of course, this doesn't reflect the entire Alevi community. In 1950s, especially when Turkish Republic moved to a multi-party regime, many Alevis actually supported the Democratic Party, which is not the Republican People's Party who established the Republic. In fact, this is mainly due to their peripheral position. So they have been oppressed during the single-party period, like many other groups. But they expected that they will be better within the Democratic Party regime. Indeed, with the, as the Democratic Party tried to get into the party politics, they get closer to Islamic groups in Turkey in order to get their support. And different tariqas, they get involved, and they, they supported the liberalization of the bans of religious symbols in the public sphere. In that sense, this short period from 1950 to 1960, Alevis have been alienated from Democratic Party, and they still moved away. So as the Democratic Party get closer to the religious groups, it alienated the Alevis. And 1960 coup was an important turning point for the Alevis. So, Alevis were in the limbo, so they're in between Kemalism and Democratic Party. And the transformation after the 1960 coup was important. After that, many of the urban Alevi population and working class Alevi population and educated Alevi population have get into the leftist politics in Turkish politics. So they get into the leftist parties, labor unions, extreme left organizations, some even terrorist organizations, and they get very well organized in the leftist politics. So you cannot even imagine a leftist politics in Turkey without the Alevis. And they didn't only change their form of organization in the 1960s, but they also transformed the Alevi narratives into in their Marxist political language. So they right now transformed the Alevi leaders of 16th, 17th century as the social rebels and people who are struggling for the social justice. They even transformed the Ali himself into a political revolutionary, and his the lineage as the revolutionary group. And they transformed the entire Ali iconography, those leftist people, into some kind of social resistance movement. And they also get into controversy with their traditional leaders, that is. So they, with this Marxist language, they criticize, you don't have any use. You have to, struggle for the good of people. So that period from 1916 to 70, Alevi tradition have been reinterpreted with the Marxist language until the 1980s. Of course, many of the Alevis also hid their identities because being Alevi was equal to being communist. And in order to function properly, some of them, of course, declared this openly, but in their workplaces, in their the schools and other places, they had to hid their Alevi identities because they don't want to be associated with being a communism. So it's a kind of liberation theology during that period. And so the narratives of Kızılbaş returned in the 1960s. So, and during the 1960s and 70s, there were also violence events. So, within the ideological spectrum, they get into violent fight with the conservative Sunnis and the ultra-nationalists in Turkish politics. And many people suffered during this period. So, 1980 military coup, stopped the ideological polarization in Turkish politics. And the period between 1980 to 1990 was an interregnum period for the Alevis. So many Alevis, more than 200,000 people have found themselves in the prisons because of ideological controversy. And they really suffered a lot, more than maybe the rightist groups, because they are overrepresented in the left groups. So it was also a traumatic experience for the Alevis, the ideological polarization of 80s and 70s. And the 1980 coup given a new opportunity for Alevis. So although some people argue that in that period we are getting lost, we are getting assimilated into Sunni tradition, and two important events played important role for the Alevi revival. So first of them was Alevi Declaration of 1989, March 1989, which was published in Hamburg Alevi Association in Germany and published in the newspapers in Turkey. So they say, we the Alevis are first-class citizens. We are loyal to Turkish Republic and Turkish principles. We appreciate other people, but we also want our tradition to be accepted. So many people signed, the Alevi intellectuals, leaders, singers, and all the people signed this. And this was the first time they declared that it was the beginning of the Alevi identity politics, I think, in the current Alevi identity politics. At the same time, other important thing was the publication of Alevilik Olayı, so Alevi Phenomena. It's a book, it's a popular book which made maybe 50 prints, but before that, there was not much of a publication on Alevilik, and people were afraid of being Alevi, and they don't express their Aleviness in the public. So, although this was a very sloppy book, which doesn't have much of a substance, it became very popular. So by getting this book, people associate themselves with their tradition. So it's a kind of reinvention of the people with the secular values, Marxist values, try to reinvent their Aleviness with the publication. And after that, the publications of Alevilik has increased, skyrocketed. So new journals, new books have emerged in the public arena. And suddenly the oral traditions transform into written tradition. And during the 1990s to maybe 2000, there are hundreds of books I tried to analyze in my dissertation. It's really, most of those texts are like identity politics texts. They don't give much of a substance, but it increases people's self-esteem. This is how we are. So it played important. The publication of Alevi identity played an important role. Also, the events of violence in 1990s. So the Sivas massacre, in which there was a Alevi popular ritual, and people and intellectuals who participated to this event have been at the hotel have been burned down. So, nobody knows exactly what happened and who started, but 10,000 people gathered around that. And it was a controversial issue as well, because at that time one of the atheist leaders, the writers, declared that he will translate Salman Rushdie's book, and there were some assaults at the same time. So, but that controversy created some tension in the city of Sivas, and which caused violent events. And a couple of other violent events also raised the consciousness of Alevis. And those three events also skyrocketed the number of the Alevi associations. So they said, only we can save ourselves. We have to do something. So after, 1 year after that event, the number of Pir Sultan Abdal associations increased to 80. So it was just a village association, and in 80 different places they opened new Alevi associations. It was difficult to maintain their institutions, but it increased the number of institutions. So within this all transforming context, so how did the boundaries of Alevi identity has been reproduced? So they come to the city, they experience different political and social experiences, and they formulated their tradition in different forms. But in the new context, they have to express themselves to Sunnis as well. So how would the boundaries of Alevi identity be reproduced? So there were a couple of things within this Alevi identity politics. First of all, they were trying to challenge the mass narratives of the Turkish national identity, which claim that Turks are, the 99% of Turkey as Muslims, which disregarded the Alevi understanding of Islam. So most Alevis said, okay, we may be Muslim, but our understanding of Islam is different. So our understanding of Islam has to be appreciated as well. So within this definition, we are left behind. Secondly, within the rural context, they used to define themselves with their primordial ties. So if you go to a village, you don't see the mosque, and the people are mostly the endogamous. So being from that village or being from an Alevi family satisfied being Alevi. So primordial ties were important and enough for defining Alevi. But in their modern urban context, they have to define themselves differently. They were encountering with other people, Sunnis, different versions of Sunnis, secular Sunnis, conservative Sunnis. They have to define in terms of values. So what are your values? What do you believe? What are your rituals? So they have to reconstruct some substance for their Aleviness. No more, being from an Alevi village, being from an Alevi family is no more sufficient to express their identity. So, thirdly, this Marxist and reactionary political language was no more sufficient for Alevis. So majority of Alevis, especially less educated groups, needed some kind of belief. They wanted to practice their rituals. And those Marxist language disenfranchised the religious rituals. So the Alevi associations, Alevi foundations with the religious content attracted more people. So right now, if you go to Alevi dergahs, you see lots of people. However, if you go to the more political institutions, less people are. You can find less people. So people tended to, the religious definition of Alevi get much more popular within this transformation process. And the other thing is that, as I mentioned, they wanted to define the Alevi with certain values and certain axiology. And new values and new axiology was enlightenment, reason, human rights, and social justice. So they abandoned the struggle Marxist language or dry secularism of the early Republican era. So they associated them with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So Ali is a humanist right now. Hacı Bektaş is himself a humanist. Hussein's struggle was right for human rights. So if you talk to the Alevi people, some of the ordinary people, so they decided to, they tried to redefine the Alevi values, Alevi axiology with these new terms. So it's, again, the Alevi tradition have been reproduced with new language. And the other thing was, once they get into the cities, they encounter with other Alevis. So people from the city of Erzincan has different rituals, practices. People from Elazığ, Malatya has different practices. They see that, even they consider some of those definitions hostile to their understanding. And so, other than having a single Alevi, they understood that there are multiplicity of Alevis, and some of those Alevis are really contradictory with their understanding of Alevi. And the other thing is that they also encountered with different Sunnis. There are, the secular Sunnis, they are conservative Sunnis, nationalist Sunnis, Sunnis who don't define themselves with their religious orientations. So they also understood that there, they used to have the notion of Yazid, so in the form of exclusion. So they say that Sunnis are like Yazid. It's constantly disenfranchised, but they understood that there are multiples of varieties of Sunnis, and we can work with some of those. So it also changed their understanding. So lastly, I would like to emphasize, so we mentioned all these changes and transformations. So I don't want to emphasize some kind of essence like the phenomenology, but what kept Alevi identity separate, and what helped to reproduce Alevi identity as opposed to a Sunni identity, despite all these political and social transformations and different political languages. I think the collective emotions and narratives of, the psychocultural narratives played a significant role in defining Alevi. And the narratives related to their historical events and historical victimhood. So, the moment you start to talk with an Alevi, they make some kind of description of Alevi, but they suddenly jump into the victimhood narratives. So I tried to talk with the 70 people, their life stories and their social stories. And these psychocultural narratives and emotional narratives are really constitutive of Alevi identity. So the narratives around the Karbala, narratives around the Anatolian folk rebellions, Ottoman Safavi conflict, the establishment of the Ulama order in Ottoman Empire, abolishing of the Bektashi order, Sivas events of 1993, and the establishment of the Turkish Republic. So I compiled more than 400 narratives about all these events. And they have really different interpretations. And within those psychocultural narratives, there are different genres. For example, the fear genre, victimhood genre, humiliation genre, shame genre, and marginalization and discrimination. For example, fear genre is very important for maintaining the boundaries of Alevi identity and connecting with the history of Alevis. So their fears about the futures and insecurities and ambiguities for the future. So, it's really important to understand the Alevi psychology of fear, the fear of assimilation, fear of Iranization. Although, they believe that the Islamist revolution can happen in Turkey. They are afraid of rising conservative understanding of Islam in Turkey. They're really afraid. Whoever you talk, they say this current administration is very religious. They're emphasizing the Diyanet. So this fear genre is really important. And the fear of Wahhabization. They believe that those, the current Sunni understanding in Turkey is like the Wahhabi understanding. So normally, the Alevi Bektashi understanding is much better, but they are trying to change this. So the fear of Wahhabization, they believe that state establishment tried to create some kind of Wahhabi understanding of Islam and marginalize Bektashi Alevi community. And also, they also have the fear of assimilation and Sunnification. So they say for centuries, Sunnis have reproduced their institutions in the modern urban context. They have, the mosques, they have, the communal organizations, they have the Diyanet, which is supported by the state. And if we cannot establish our institutions, we'll get lost. So one of the major fear is the fear of assimilation. And secondly, the humiliation genre. You can only understand humiliation when you talk with the people. So they say for centuries, those people, Sunnis and the Ottoman state, described as people, Alevis are not clean, they have really bad, they are sexually pervert, whatever they cook cannot be eaten. Those accusations, defamations really affected Alevis, and because of this, once people got into the schools, military service, and workplaces, they experienced those stories. They heard those stories, and they really, negatively influenced, and they also felt religiously discriminated. So they connected those personal events, personal experiences, with the history of victimhood, and those events of humiliation are really important turning points in people's lives. So when you listen people's the life story, so I wasn't caring too much about my Alevis, but in workplace, those my co-workers saying Alevis are like that. That was turning point in my life. So I started to learn more about Alevi tradition. So I was atheist, but I started to learn more about it. So those events really, the humiliation events are really important turning points in Alevi's lives. And also the shame. Most Alevis, especially people who are in the bureaucratic roles and Alevi businessmen, some of them really hid their identities. They say, sometimes being Alevi may be impediment. So they were afraid that, and when you talk to them personally, they say, only a few people know that I'm Alevi because I was afraid that time. So it's a kind of personal shame. They internalize those humiliation experiences. And the other thing is the marginalization and discrimination. For many Alevis, they say they couldn't get the jobs, they couldn't get the the social status they deserve. So for many of them, tell stories about this marginalization and discrimination. So before ending my presentation, I would like to read a poem or statement that was published at the back of Alevi Journal. It's really interesting, giving a sense of fear genre within the Alevis. So it was printed in 2006, June 2006, in the Pir Sultan Abdal Journal. So they first turned the call to prayer into Arabic. You listened. They said you can even bring caliphate back if you really want. You assumed that this was democratic request. They opened the Quran course and the Imam schools all over. Religion courses became mandatory constitutionally. You accepted that. The waiting became widespread and the number of mosques exceeded the number of schools. You considered it as a freedom of religion. They then interrupted your lifestyle and killed the people who do not fast. You were surprised. They killed the scientists and writers. They smashed the journalists and MPs, burned your poets and dancers. You kept questioning the identities of the perpetrators. At the end, they will knock your door. You will have no one to help yourself other than you. So this is one example from the fear genre. So we can get into the details of the narratives or details of the different versions of Alevi understanding. Thank you for this.